County.
Oh, I do love the water and the lagoons in Foster City. I lived there when I was up to 8 months old, but not after that. To those of you who joined, we're introducing ourselves in the chat. Share your name, your jurisdiction, something you love about your community. Yeah, Jennifer.
Hi, just to let you know. Oh, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Just to let you know, Yaling, I believe you are unmuted and I'm hearing an echo from up there. I'm still hearing some echo.
Yeah, I hear an echo from someone too.
Yeah. Oh, and I just somebody just asked for closed captioning enabled.
If everybody could mute themselves to try to remove that. I think the echoing stopped. Nope, still going. I wonder if I can mute everybody. Renee, can you try to, are you able to mute all?
That may have done
Now
it.
I'm muted. All right. I think we'll get started now. So wanted to thank all of you for joining us today for the final session in the Let's Talk Housing, Creating More Affordable Future webinar series for people in San Mateo County. I'm Christy Wong with Baird and Driscoll. The first thing we wanted to do is to welcome our participants for whom English is not their first language. And so I wanted to turn it over to Isabel and then Kathy to explain how to use the interpretation feature in Zoom. Isabel?
Do you want to go to the slide where
Yeah.
that's visible? Okay, perfect. Bienvenidos a todos y todas. Nos alegra mucho que estén acá. Si hablan español, pues es muy bueno porque tenemos hoy en día interpretación simultánea. Entonces, para acceder a la interpretación en español, pueden mirar ahí como está en la imagen que va a aparecer un mundo que dice interpretación en la barra de abajo. En este momento no lo pueden ver porque estoy hablando a todo el salón, pero cuando aparezca pueden escoger ahí y seleccionar el idioma de español. Muchas gracias.
Kathy?
Okay. 大家好，我個名叫 Kathy Wu。今日歡迎你哋嚟參加我哋呢個會議，係第4個會議，係亦係最後一個會議，關於呢個可負擔房屋。咁如果你要廣東話翻譯啦，我哋呢度底下呢個屏幕咧，就有個好似地球儀咁，你點擊一下咧，就選中文或者廣東話咁樣。Okay, thank you.
Great. I'm going to start the interpretation feature now. So can you see the globe in the bottom panel? Great. Okay. So thank you so much to Isabel and Kathy. Please feel free to jump in and remind.
Okay, I can start. Okay, let me see.
Yeah, Kathy, you can choose.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, on my language.
Great. Isabel and Kathy, please feel free to signal in the chat maybe if the speakers and I are speaking too quickly. So again, I'm Christy Wong with Baird and Driscoll. We've worked with all the jurisdictions in San Mateo County for more than a decade on housing policy, including their housing elements and Let's Talk Housing, which is an outreach effort of all the cities, the towns, and the county in San Mateo County. So we're trying to increase awareness and participation in the housing element update process, which is currently underway. It's something that's required by the state. The goal is to make sure that everyone's involved in shaping the shared future across the county. So over the course of the series, we've talked about how planning for more housing in our communities is a public health issue, it's a racial equity issue, it's a climate issue, it's an economic issue, and it's a community issue. Allowing for new homes in our communities helps workers spend time with their families instead of commuting long distances. It helps employers hire and retain good workers who can afford to live nearby. It allows us all to live in communities that are integrated by income and by race. And it can help us do our part to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and build in a climate-friendly way. So today we want to spend some time talking about how integrating new housing into our communities can be done in a way that protects the things that we love about our communities and improves the quality of life in our communities. Where do we have space to create these new housing choices, and how do we promote design excellence in new buildings and new public spaces? So here's a snapshot of our agenda for today. And I do want to respond to the note, how can I hear the Cantonese? If you go to the bar at the bottom of your screen, there is a globe. If you click on the globe, you should be able to choose Chinese. So today we're first going to do a quick demographic poll to understand who's in the room. We'll have a presentation from our speakers, time for Q&A, and then some short breakout discussions to debrief the conversation afterward. Okay. So before we do that, let's do the poll. And just as a reminder, for those of you who have done this before, we're not, trying to identify who is in the room. We're really trying to understand who's not in the room. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can take care of one logistical thing while you fill out the demographic poll. Perfect timing. Okay, I think we'll close the poll now. Thank you very much for filling it out, and I'll share the results in case anyone is interested. And while we do that, I will introduce our speakers for today. So Benjamin Grant is a city planner, urban designer, curator, and teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. He spent over a decade at SPUR, the Urban Policy Research Organization, where he served as urban design policy director. He is the author of numerous reports and studies, including the Ocean Beach Master Plan and award-winning climate adaptation strategy for San Francisco's Open Coast. Today he'll be presenting some work that he did while we were at SPUR, which we're showing as an example of a way to think about the different kinds of places that we have in San Mateo County, and what are the ways that we can build within them in a desirable and people-friendly way. Our second speaker is Karen Murray. She's a partner at Van Meter Williams Pollock and provides firm-wide leadership and direction for projects ranging in scale from the neighborhood to the individual building. Her unique blend of architecture and urban design skills allows her to act as a bridge between the two disciplines, providing implementable design solutions, feasibility studies, and prototypical building design for many of the firm's projects. So now I'm going to hand off to Ben and Karen to help us understand the different types of places of San Mateo County and how urban design and planning for new housing can be an opportunity in our communities. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time to field your questions at the end. Ben.
Thanks very much, Christy, and good evening to everyone. Great that there's so many of you joining us and interested in this issue, which is a very significant one for the Bay Area, as we all know. So I'm going to be introducing some ideas from this analysis that we did of the Bay Area as a region and the different kinds of places that exist here, and talking about different strategies for providing housing in different kinds of places. And then Karen is going to step in and talk about some specific examples of projects that have been able to implement new housing in different kinds of places, with some examples that are very pertinent to San Mateo County. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the premises of this work. This was done as part of SPUR's regional strategy, which was an attempt to look out 50 years into the future and ask ourselves how we can really start to grapple with some of our region's most pressing problems. So it's very much a long-term view. And we know that a lot of growth is going to be coming to the Bay Area, and we don't really control that, but what we do control is how we respond to it and how we accommodate to it. And we know that we have been under providing housing since the 1980s. It's taken a whole generation for us to get into the crisis that we're in, and it's going to take quite a long time to get out. So we need to have a clear direction of where we're trying to get. And I think one thing most of us agree on is that we should be able to grow without sprawling, without building over additional open space and farmland. And it makes sense to grow in areas that are already urbanized, close to the transportation and infrastructure, close to jobs. And one thing that emerges from this work is that every different type of place in the Bay Area needs to do its part. Housing needs to go everywhere, but that doesn't mean that every place has to grow in the same way. One size definitely does not fit all. And we're going to try to talk through what that can look like in different kinds of places. And understand that as much as we're showing lots of change here, we're talking about a 50-year vision. Our grandchildren's Bay Area. Are our grandchildren going to be able to afford to live here and take part in this community? And in order to get there, we need to be willing to accept some significant change to get more housing into our communities. Okay, next slide. So in order to think about the different kinds of places in the region, we started by asking ourselves the question is, what do our communities look like today? What does the built environment in the Bay Area consist of? And only then can we answer the question of how can we start to change it in a way to solve our problems. So we used a very complicated set of data and used computer learning tools, digital modeling, to essentially divide the Bay Area into 14 different place types, 3 of which are mostly open space, 4 of which mostly jobs, 3 of which mostly housing, and then 4 of which are mixed in your denser urban cores. And every single part of the 9-county Bay Area was placed into one of these place types. Next slide, please. And you can see, if you squint, hopefully this is big enough to get some idea on your screen, this is the 9-county Bay Area, and these are the 14 place types in half-mile by half-mile squares. And you can see San Mateo County there, kind of in the middle of the map, just below San Francisco. And the way the different place types are laid out across the region. And without knowing too many details about them, we can see from the way the colors spread out that we can read something that we already know about the Bay Area, which is that we have a few denser urban centers: San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Palo Alto, et cetera. San Mateo, I'd be remiss in not mentioning. And then lower density areas around that, followed by open space. And we tried to make the colors intuitive so you could kind of read the structure of the Bay Area by looking at a map like this. Next slide, please. And then we learned some things from this analysis. We had some findings. Next slide, please. So one piece of good news that was very reassuring. Whoop, before that, we're surging ahead here. Can we go back, please? Yes. Open space remains abundant in the Bay Area. 84% of the 9 counties is still in open space and agriculture. And that's thanks to the diligent work of generations of people protecting open space, a lot of which is in San Mateo County, and agriculture. And that's a great success story. Next slide, please. And one thing we know is that not all places perform in the same way when we think about some of the challenges, particularly of transportation and walkability. As you get from the open space place types on the far left to the very, very densest in the middle of downtown San Francisco on the far right, you can see that commuting in a car by yourself goes down and down and down, and the ability to walk to places goes up and up and up. And when we think about the efficiency and the environmental sustainability of growth, we tend to want to favor those more efficient kinds of urban places, put density, put new housing in the denser areas where people can walk to things. Next slide, please. However, one of the challenges we face is that those urban places are very, very scarce. So if you look at 2 of these place types, urban neighborhoods, which is some of the residential areas of San Francisco and Oakland, only 0.06% of the land is devoted to those areas, whereas what we call cul-de-sac suburbs, which is your post-war auto-oriented suburbs, are 26%. That's 40 times the area. So making a small change across a huge area can have just as much impact as making a really big change in a little tiny area, which is part of the idea that every different kind of place needs to do its part. Next slide, please. And equity matters everywhere. We are really struggling with deep structural racial and economic inequity across the region. It's been a source of a lot of discussion. Every place needs to do its part, but what that looks like may be different in different kinds of areas. For example, in communities of concern that have been disinvested and that have faced displacement pressure, we need to be careful about sudden change that can negatively impact existing communities. And at the same time, in other areas, we have high resource areas where there are good schools and better access to upward mobility for low-income people. And those places have been closed off to people moving in. So we need to open those up and allow more people to take advantage of those resources. So the physical solutions might be similar, and we need housing in all kinds of locations, but we need to take equity into account when we think about different kinds of places. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 different place types that are very common in San Mateo County. Talk about kind of some of what makes them different, some of what makes them unique, and then what kinds of strategies might make sense over the next 50 years to add housing in that kind of setting. And you'll see that the strategies are all the same. And then after each one, Karen is going to step in and show us real world projects that actually get this done. So the first is cul-de-sac suburbs. And what we mean by this is neighborhoods that were built after World War II, that were built largely around the car, and that are almost always one type of housing, single family homes, one after the other. And you can see in the image below, that would be a familiar kind of suburban streetscape with single family houses that are mostly garage. And we imagine over a 50-year period transitioning from this sort of one-size-fits-all type community to a much more diverse community, both socially and in terms of housing type. Because one of the things that this kind of place does is it enforces one idea of what a household is. Next slide, please. If there's only single-family houses, that's fine if you're a mom and a dad and 2 kids, but what if you're a multi-generational family? What if you are single adults? What if you are empty nesters and your kids have moved out and there's only big houses available? What if you're young people forming a group household for the first time? So it kind of enforces one idea of a certain family and is also not very efficient in terms of environmental performance. So people like these places. They're spacious, they're nice, they represent a certain kind of American dream, right? But on the other hand, They are exclusive because of their one kind of housing, and they are very limited in terms of your ability to walk places. So almost anything, the proverbial quart of milk, requires getting in a car, and which makes them relatively inefficient from an environmental point of view, hard to provide good services for because they're so spread out, and dependent on cars. So next slide, please. This is kind of how these places, the cul-de-sac suburb, lays out across the region. And you can see, first of all, there's a lot of it, right? All those orange dots. And where it's located tends to be outside those denser center cities. And then we did a kind of statistical portrait of each place type, which I won't go into in detail, but one good shorthand is the walk score, which is 48, which is very low. It's very difficult to walk around these places to access much. You can walk around sort of recreationally, but that's about it. Okay, next slide. And this is our sort of artist conception of some of the strategies you might use to introduce a little more mixture and complexity to these areas. First of all, turning the streets from big wide swaths of asphalt that are just for the movement and parking of cars into places that people can inhabit and make use of, and much greener. And then also allowing a lot of different kinds of housing units to be slotted in among the existing houses, whether that's backyard cottages, or other additions, or combining a couple of houses into several units, all while maintaining the sort of appealing kind of residential character of these neighborhoods. We're not talking about skyscrapers dropping from the sky into places like this, but there's a lot of strategies you can do to work gentle density into these kinds of neighborhoods. And Karen is going to talk a little bit more about some examples.
Thanks, Van. Yep, here is an image of a typical cul-de-sac suburb. This is in San Jose, just swaths of low-rise single-family housing, like as Ben was describing. So I will, walk through ways in which we can start to look at how to allow more housing in these neighborhoods. So next slide. And the question really is, should each lot really only have one house? If we're looking at these. And if we look closer at them, we can look at the next slide. The answer is, if you go to the next slide, Christy, that maybe they already do. Sorry. So if you look at these, this is just a blow up of that picture we looked at before, and you can, start to, I just highlighted in pink, that people have, always, redone a garage to be a residence for, a mother-in-law or grandma, or, had a larger house behind. So these neighborhoods, like from the surface might look like single family only, but maybe they actually really have more already and can continue to that pattern. And the next slide shows a couple of different examples of how we could do that with accessory dwelling units. So that's the name for these additional dwelling units on a single family property. So the one on the left is just a little backyard cabin that could be any type of residence, and then the one on the right is a garage redo of adjacent to a house. So we can add more homes without altering the pattern or the character of the neighborhood. Next slide. And another kind of neighborhood that could be built in, looking at that single family pattern, you can also look at more dense, compact forms. So still single family houses, but maybe it's less car centric. Cars are not front and center in the place. It has open spaces. The people can, very walkable in this neighborhood. This is up in Seattle. And back to Ben, I believe we'll talk about streetcar suburbs next.
Great, thanks, Karen. So the next type we're going to talk about is what we call small lot and streetcar suburbs, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but basically these are residential areas that were built before World War II, before we assumed that everyone had a car, and a lot of them were built around the streetcar lines and rail lines that were all over the Bay Area at the time. And so while they, in many cases, started off predominantly as single-family homes, in fact, they are pretty mixed. Some from the very beginning and some by changing over time through inhabitation and change. So you can see that image on the bottom. That's an image of a street in Berkeley that has clearly an old house, a similar looking house that has either been rehabilitated or built to imitate the other one, and then a fourplex apartment building that is an old 1920s building. That building is illegal in many parts of our communities, even though it's a beautiful older building type that works very, very well and is nicely situated in its neighborhood. So these neighborhoods have a very important advantage in terms of walkability and sustainability over the cul-de-sac suburb, the later suburb. And that's that they're usually built on a grid. And they're built on a grid because that is a good way to move through a city on foot. And in many of these places, you had to be able to walk to the streetcar line. So you can't be made to walk way, way, way out of your way, out of the cul-de-sac around a big loop to the gate. That just doesn't work. It's not efficient. These areas with their gridded streets have some inherent advantages. And the fact that they're also mixed up in terms of unit types means they're also accessible to a lot of different kinds of households. And as a result, these neighborhoods are much more diverse, both in terms of unit type, building type, and in terms of socioeconomic and racial diversity. And that is great. On the downside, there aren't very many of these. They are scarce, they are desirable, and they exist in a relatively small number of places. So some of the older cities of the Bay Area, the core of San Mateo, Palo Alto, Berkeley and Oakland, very often have this pattern. But because they are scarce and desirable, in many cases, they're also vulnerable to gentrification and displacement. These places have often become very, very expensive. So one of the challenges is how we let more people have access to these walkable kinds of places without having them get so expensive that they push out existing communities. So let's move forward. Next slide. This is, you can see the distribution of the streetcar suburbs, and it makes sense, right? It's a little bit closer into those urban cores along the peninsula, along the rail lines, as well as in San Francisco and the inner East Bay. These places will be familiar to you. And notice that walk score is now up to 74, much, much higher, despite being relatively quiet residential neighborhoods with a residential character. But in many of these neighborhoods, you can walk to a local store or restaurant. They're very often pretty well served by public transit, so you're not always depending on a car, even though people do drive in these communities. Next slide, please. I've touched on most of this, but under the assets, that walkable street pattern is so important. A mix of housing types allows for a diversity of households. Social and economic diversity to start with. But then on the downside, they are scarce and they often are very expensive. So there's a risk of displacement in these communities. In common with the cul-de-sac suburb, you have the challenge, or maybe it's an asset, it could be both, that it's made up of many, many, many small lots. So in one of these half mile by half mile squares, you might have 500 different owners. Well, so that place is not going to change overnight very dramatically, right? It's going to be much more of an incremental parcel by parcel change. But on the other hand, people also love these neighborhoods, and sometimes that comes with a desire to keep them the same or even make them how they used to be and resist change. So that's one of the challenges of change in these kinds of communities. Okay, next slide, please. And I think that's Karen talking about some more examples of how to actually get some more housing in these neighborhoods.
Actually, Ben, can I pause here really
Please.
quickly? One of our Cantonese speakers can't find their way to the channel. Okay, Karen, I think maybe you should go, start your section. Oh, Ben, were you going?
This was just an image of one of those corridors that have transit available and restaurants and services in those streetcar suburb neighborhoods. Because they were built around these corridors in the first place, very often those areas still exist with retail and with slightly larger lots. So you can do some bigger buildings that are well integrated into the neighborhood.
Karen, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. You'd think we'd be over this by now. Ben mentioned that in a lot of these streetcar suburbs, you know, these types of housing that are not just single families already exist. He showed a couple of examples, and you might walk by them and not even notice that they were there. So this is just a traditional duplex in San Jose. We can walk through. We'll kind of click through pretty quickly on these. This is a bungalow court in Palo Alto, and it's similar to that, the cottage cluster I showed earlier, but there's, you know, 4 or 6 houses here, but when you're looking at it right from the street, it looks like 2, you know, little single family houses. And this might take up a double lot in one of these streetcar suburbs. And they happen often. Another, next one. Townhouses can also fit in really comfortably in these types of neighborhoods. And I saw in the chat just pop up, you know, the question about missing middle housing, and, you know, new developments like these can provide that kind of housing. So they can fit within streetcar suburbs or, you know, other types of existing neighborhoods where you have, you know, maybe this was a small, you know, empty lot kind of back at the end of the road, and then, you know, filled that with housing that, you know, addresses the street and is walkable and really comfortable feeling. Mm-hmm.
It might be just worth mentioning real quick for those who aren't familiar with the term missing middle housing. Okay. We talk about that as sort of 2 to 6 units on a lot, which is not built very often and is actually against the law in a lot of places. That's why we call it missing middle, and it's a wonderful way to fill out a middle range of density with these very friendly types that you're showing.
Thanks, Ben. Great. And I also see it as kind of the middle, kind of a middle income too, right? So it's, you know, it's small enough that it could be affordable. This is an interesting one. This was it's a small apartment building in Alameda, which does not like to build apartment buildings very often, but it was for developmentally disabled adults, and the residents there wanted, you know, that lived in this neighborhood wanted to have a place for their children to live nearby. And so you know, we did this project for them. And, you know, I think that's kind of the key as we look at these types of neighborhoods and what's available there. But it's really to provide, you know, housing for your children and, you know, other people who might not have the opportunity to live in a neighborhood that's getting more expensive. And, you know, just then this, you know, is looking at the opportunity, you know, as you're moving into the downtowns of these types of suburbs away from the strictly residential districts, you might get larger lots and availability for more units or more housing there. And there's one more. I think this is a new housing in downtown San Carlos that replaced a parking lot. It replaces the parking lot with, there is parking still here, but from the street, you know, you see, you know, mixed use and residential, and it really feels like part of the city and the neighborhood.
Okay, and the last place type we're going to talk about today is something completely different, also very familiar to San Mateo County, which is office parks. And there's some big differences, obviously, between office parks and the 2 kinds of residential suburbs we were talking about before, but they're not always the most obvious ones. I would point to, well, first of all, just to describe what they are, these are single-use places, workplaces, commercial or industrial R&D space, very often surrounded by lots and lots and lots of surface parking. They're very much just about being efficient and serving one function. and they're not very efficient in terms of the use of space, and they're not very efficient or sustainable in terms of transportation. You kind of have to drive to these places, and that takes a big toll on our environment and on the quality of life in the region with traffic and so forth. On the other hand, in contrast to the lots of little tiny lots with individual owners and the other two place sites we looked at, these are typically very large lots under single ownership. And in contrast to a lot of concern or skepticism about a lot of change in some of those other neighborhood types, office parks aren't really sacred to anyone, even the people that work in them. They're just kind of functional. So it's not a place that people are going to be really nervous about change, and it is under single ownership. So you can use these as opportunities to do things to accommodate quite a lot of housing and pretty big change, if you can make the market and policy case to do that. So if we complement the jobs uses which exist there, which is just 9 to 5, with other kinds of uses that balance against that, residential that's active in the evening, and entertainment and retail that are active on the weekends, you can create a balanced community and still retain the important jobs and economic function of these places. So next slide, please. You can see where these are located, scattered in the commercial and industrial areas, largely in the flatlands adjacent to the bay. Very, very low walk score, of course, because these are just built around the car and mostly surface parking. But important to remember that they are very important economically. You know, our economic lifeblood is oftentimes in the innovation businesses that inhabit these places. So we do need these job centers, but we can add other uses to them to create balance and mixed places. Next slide, please. So I think I've already talked about most of this. Lots of land that not utilized very efficiently. On the plus side, big lots, so you can do a lot, but they are very car dependent today, with all the negative aspects of that, in terms of transportation, in terms of urban heat and water pollution and so forth. But they're ripe opportunities for significant change, in ways that in some ways is easier than doing change across many, many small lots. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a rendering of imagining one of these 50 years from now, if it actually grew up and became a mixed urban center with a lot of jobs still there, but a lot of complementary activities as well, whether it's housing, either for the workers that actually work there or for other populations, and then retail and cultural uses and so forth to bring this place to life at night. And then when you get those complementary uses, suddenly it becomes a much more reasonable proposition to have other ways of getting around, whether it's getting around on foot in the immediate vicinity, or whether having a critical mass of people that allows you to actually have meaningful transit run into these places. So there's a tremendous untapped opportunity of sort of underused land that can accommodate a lot of the housing we need to build relatively easily. And Karen is going to talk through some examples. Oh, and that's just an artist's impression of the office park of the future.
And here is a real live example of a reimagined retail and office center. So this is San Antonio Center in Mountain View, really emphasizing, parks, walkability. You've got the mixed use. You can walk from your house to retail. We have more. I'll go through quickly. So we have a couple more examples. The next one is Warm Springs BART. Speaking of, how these new developments can really decrease driving. This neighborhood is located directly adjacent to Warm Springs BART, a new BART station out there. It was formerly a parking lot. You can see in the image on the right, there's still parking there, BART parking, but it's also being turned. It will be, when it's fully built out, 1,000 new residences on 36 acres. And the final example is closer to home, Bay Meadows, which is, sorry, just heard something.
I thought it was on sale.
Someone, it's maybe not muted. So anyway, Bay Meadows is, 83 acres, really large. It's large enough to imagine, it allows for a whole lot of different types of spaces in neighborhoods with open space and, and retail and office, and ultimately over 1,200 residences. And I just have some images of some of those types of places that are within Bay Meadows here. So, smaller, 3 or 4, kind of moving density up in density, different architectural styles, within this different neighborhood. And then this is more in the mixed use center, getting higher buildings and more office types of uses here too. And finally, to wrap up our piece, I wanted to talk a little bit. This is not one of the place types that Ben studied in his place type report, but I think that it's really important when we're looking at development and how to increase, where do we find opportunities to build that, with the least impact or maybe the most impact in terms of additional housing. And commercial corridors have always stood out to us. If you think of El Camino Real, and that's what this is a photo of, it links all of the places that we talked about together. So as it travels through the peninsula, it's not the only one. You can imagine up in, we're in, there's a Redwood Highway or other ones like this. But you can see the cul-de-sac suburbs here and the streetcar suburbs maybe to the south. And what these corridors, commercial corridors, do is allow for these larger plots of land and larger sites that can provide more housing without impacting the neighbors behind. And it also, if we go to the next slide, what judicious development or focusing development can do is really create activity centers for, that are become an amenity to the existing residents. So you can add, adding mixed use and retail and coffee shops. And if you focus them, instead of just spreading them out along the length of the road, you can really start to, develop places at these nodes. And so here's a few examples of ones that have recently been built. Here's mixed use. There's a Pete's here and a small grocery in Mountain View and residential, of course. Others, this one's in Santa Clara, mixed use, nice outdoor areas and other residential surrounding it. New housing in Belmont. This is not a mixed use, but just how those larger sites that are along the corridors allow for a substantial amount of housing. This Los Altos. So you can see, it's really throughout the county and the peninsula that along these roads, you can get new housing developments. And this is sort of the largest example I have, but this multifamily building replaced a long-term storage facility. So you can imagine that it enlivened this part of Santa Clara and really brought new neighbors to a place that really was not well utilized before.
Did either of you have some closing comments that you wanted to make before we open it up to questions?
I would just reiterate that we need housing everywhere, and every kind of place has to do its part to make up for our sort of failures as a region over the past 30 years. And we see the results of that with the tragedy of homelessness in our communities and people that can't afford to stay here. So every place needs to do its part, but not every housing solution has to look the same. And we can be sensitive to different kinds of places, and we can work with the assets the assets of each different type of place. So everybody's got to do their bit, but we can do it in ways that are smart and sensitive and make different kinds of communities better. New neighbors doesn't have to be a bad thing. If we tend to think about, parking and traffic, but new neighbors can mean a lot more than that. It can mean, restaurants and cafes and populated streets that feel safe and comfortable and sociable. And there's a lot of good things that we can get from this. And we can't just close our eyes to the crisis that we're facing, but we can solve it in ways that make better places for everyone.
Right. And I would say something similar, that it's really, we can't fill the demand with just one strategy, right? We really have to layer all of these things together as we're looking at planning for the future to, build a good foundation. And it's not just a question of more housing, but having housing closer to transit where it's available, it provides huge environmental benefits. People don't have to drive to work. People can walk around their neighborhoods, and it really brings benefits to everyone for that. So
Great. Thank you. Really appreciate you guys sharing all this great imagery and your experiences with everyone. So there are lots of questions. So I'm going to go through some of them. And if you maybe try to keep the answers short so we can get through most of them. So this was, I think, for Ben in terms of the plan, but I think it could also be it could also relate to, the Bay Area's, the plan, Plan Bay Area, and how we are thinking about growth generally across the region. So how is the plan impacted by the future of work post-pandemic, which will involve less commuting?
Now, I assume when we're talking about the plan, you mean the regional strategy that this research was supporting.
I think that's what the question came out of, but I think that your answer might also apply to the region, MTC
Sure.
and ABAGs, the regional government's approach to this as well.
Yeah, well, this is very much a hot topic because nobody knows what the world looks like post-COVID. We know what it looks like during COVID, and we know that, among other things, it's a lot of empty office buildings. And a lot of people working very hard to bring goodies and food and goods to your front porch, which has huge implications, right? If we continue to or to many of us work at home, those of us that are able to work at home, that will mean a lot less commuting. It will mean a real shift in terms of regional movement and location. I am of the opinion that as amazing as Zoom is, and the fact that we've been able to continue with stuff like this at all during COVID is really remarkable. I think work will continue to be flexible, but I also think ultimately human beings are social animals, and there's no substitute for being face to face. And so I do believe that our job centers and our urban centers will come back. I think flexible work and some remote work will remain. But I don't think we've seen the end of the city. I really don't.
There were several questions about parking. Some of it's, how do you deal with parking when you're adding ADUs and the sort of small scale missing middle to neighborhoods? And then on the flip side, what about better ways of using the large parking lots and sort of the office park scenarios? I think, we still envision that there's some parking in those areas, and how do you use that when it's not being used at all hours?
it's interesting. There's a couple different, I feel like all of our work is based on building on parking lots these days, but there's a few things. If parking is needed still for certain uses, then that parking can be structured, so it's not just a single flat expanse of parking, and you can build. Then that allows you to build around it. In Berkeley, and all around, like the Warm Springs project, BART is actually starting to develop on their parking lots, and it offers an opportunity, I think, that they are like the office parks place type, big swaths of land owned by a single owner that can be developed into mixed use and housing for the future. So I think that we should look at parking lots as an opportunity. And you know, if it's located adjacent to transit, it allows for hopefully less parking to be needed for the residents there.
Yeah, people in our line of work spend, even though we're all about places that move beyond the car, we seem to spend our entire lives thinking about parking, because it is it's an issue of concern for people, but it's also a big driver of our development of our buildings. Is that they're designed to try to accommodate a certain amount of parking without creating a bunch of blank walls and stuff, and that's really hard. On the plus side, over the course of of our career, we were actually in graduate school at the same time, Karen and I, you've seen a real shift in the assumption about parking from, you know, at least one, if not two spaces per unit 20 years ago, to actually buildings being built, you know, multifamily buildings being built with no parking at all in urban areas today, which was considered to be impossible. And so there's a real shift in that assumption that you know, a housing unit equals a car. And the more places we build that accommodate life not in a car, where you can walk to things, the less parking we need, and the less parking is an issue. So you don't yeah, it just becomes less of a burden and less of a cost. It makes housing more affordable if you don't have to build a $60,000 structured parking space with every unit. And the sky doesn't fall, you know, sometimes you got to hunt for a parking space. Okay.
So a couple of design questions for the designers. One question is, you know, if there are people who really want to support new housing, but you've seen a lot, you know, in your experience, you've seen a lot of clunky, sort of shoddy construction, or sort of, you know, blank walls or two-story buildings that are looming over other buildings. What are there ways, I guess, what are the tools for ensuring that new housing in your community is built in a, you know, pleasant and desirable way?
Well, a lot of communities now, as we are developing them, and existing communities are starting to develop design standards. They're called objective design standards that try to address that question. That people have seen what really, you know, bad things can happen, and like you're saying, might support new housing, but they want to make sure that it's quality and addresses the, you know, is compatible with the neighborhood and things like that. So, you know, often, so there's these design standards that can dictate certain things, that can dictate, you know, that buildings must have unit entries, you know, facing the street, and, you know, porches and setbacks. They can say, like Ben started to talk about this, that parking, if you do have parking, structured parking, that it has to be behind the housing. So you see, you don't see a blank wall. You see, you know, it's tucked away and is dealt with sensitively. So I think, you know, cities will do specific plans and plans for downtowns that also address these kind of things. So I think that, you know, as cities and more development is expected, that these types of guidelines and plans are being implemented to get at that. And usually those plans have public processes where neighbors and residents can weigh in on what they think is important about the neighborhood.
And I would just add on that point, how you show up is very important. If you show up and say, I think this is ugly and I don't want another one of those dumb buildings in my neighborhood, you're not going to have a positive impact on our housing crisis. If you show up and say, yes, let's build housing in our neighborhood, I think we could do a little better on this, that, and the other thing, and let's make this project the best project that it can be, you're going to get a very different response, and you're both going to get a better building, and you're going to make progress on the crisis that we're all facing. So framing, you know, making sure to be clear that you are in favor of moving housing forward, doesn't mean you can't advocate for the best possible design, or, and of course there's differing opinions on what looks good, but you can advocate for a sensitive project.
Great. One last design related question, which was that along the peninsula, many of the single family neighborhoods are located in hilly areas, which, may be difficult places to build, maybe not as accessible to transit, and just curious about the approach to adding more missing middle housing in those kinds of locations.
It's funny. I was saying we spend a lot of time looking at parking lots. Another thing that we look at are hillside sites that have been considered unbuildable, and trying to figure out ways to do that you can. It may not work well for a single family house. It would fit, but you can try to you can design around those hillsides of house. Like San Francisco, there are many sort of terraced houses that look more like a hill town going up a hill, that could fit in with the single family neighborhood. So it's there those types of places are, I think, some of the few that weren't initially developed, so they have a lot of opportunity there.
I would just add that the most efficient kind of housing is the housing that's right near the stores and transportation and is very walkable. But we still need all kinds of housing. So although a unit of housing next to a BART station solves an environmental problem and a social problem and a housing problem, a unit of housing in a suburb or a hilly, more remote area is still a unit of housing that we desperately need. So they're both important.
Great. Well, thank you both for so much for joining us. There was some great discussion and other questions in the chat that I'm sorry we won't get to today, but we'll look for other opportunities to get those questions addressed for everyone. So we wanted to do a quick breakout groups for everyone to help you connect with some of your neighbors. So the prompts today are, is there something we've talked about today that you think might make your community better? Are there things that you're concerned about? Or imagine one of these buildings we looked at today in your neighborhood. Where would it go best and how would it feel? So we're going to take maybe 6 or 7 minutes for these conversations. You will not have any facilitators in the room, so please remember to be respectful of other people's opinions and give everyone a chance to speak if they want to. And then we'll come back and close out. Vu Bang, if you want, can you break us into breakout groups? Thanks again to Ben and Karen for joining us today.